Welcome to another episode of the Workplace Therapy Podcast. My name's Scott Arrieta. I'm the founder and CEO of Unity & Company. We're a training and consulting firm that focuses on leveraging a strategic understanding of human experiences to help organizations unlock best-in-class performance. Today, I'm joined by Annie Brown. Annie is the head of people at Phi, a company that's focused on building a super cool tech-enabled dog collar. Prior to joining Phi, Annie had several positions on the Stitch Fix People and Culture team, which is where she and I actually first met. Annie, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
It is my pleasure. My pleasure. All right. So first up, as we reconnected and I reflect on your career path so far, I'm always so amazed when I reflect and see just how much you've accomplished and grown at what feels like lightning speed. Reflecting back on your career, what are some of the most important things that factored into your rapid advancement, do you think?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. There's two things that stick out to me. One, which is more in my control, and one, which I would say is more what felt like luck to me. But the first one is I had really great managers. So that's the one I would say was less in my control, but something I'm super grateful for. Specifically in my early career, I had people that really invested in me. And that was something that I did not take for granted. So building relationships, asking questions, shadowing those managers, things to that effect, and really learning directly hands-on experience. There's no better experience than that. And then the second one was being hungry for feedback and learning very on just how critical and valuable that feedback was. And so asking a lot of questions, being curious, and being humble enough to take tough feedback or constructive feedback and use that to my advantage as well to really grow and pivot and ideally become maybe, the next better version of myself. And so I would say those two things together, really, I credit, a lot of my success in my career to those two things.
I love that. I think those insights are so powerful. I think it's very common, to see people who've kind of reached the top of their respective professional ladders, often harken back and say that like one of the biggest things that kind of got them or gave them the confidence to kind of climb the ladder so successfully was just great examples set by great managers. I love the second piece though that you call out about just being open to feedback, being hungry, being curious. We talk a lot on this podcast about trust and psychological safety. And I wonder if those two things are like intertwined. Like, do you feel, reflecting back on some of the leadership experiences you've had, that the examples set for you by your direct managers that were mentoring you actually made it easier for you to like lean into feedback and seek it in a more trusting way?
100%. I think I would not be as open to feedback as I am today if the original setting in which I received that feedback had not been one of trust and of I'm giving you this feedback because I think it will help you. And so how that feedback was shaped and where it was delivered, in the privacy of a one-on-one conversation, that was also pre-pandemic. And so we had the benefit of being in person and really spending time together and getting to know each other, sitting beside each other. I think those settings absolutely enabled me to be in a mindset where I was ready and willing to receive feedback from people that I knew were in my corner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that foundation of trust and psychological safety, I think, is just such an important prerequisite to being able to hear and digest that feedback. And I think you said something really interesting that I just want to make sure I pull out so that everybody can focus on it. But it's this idea that your managers and mentors are providing you this feedback that they know could be potentially hard for you to hear, but you had trust and confidence that they were telling that to you for your own good, right? Yeah. It wasn't like, a perfunctory, like, hey, you need to get better at this, and almost like an accusatory kind of way. But it's like, hey, like I see the potential in you and I see greatness in you. And like, here are some areas where you may want to focus a little bit more if you want to kind of maximize that potential and influence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think that's a really great way actually to kick off our conversation, Annie, because, when you and I were kind of getting together talking about like what we might want to spend the time talking about on the podcast, it very quickly became apparent that there was a huge opportunity to talk about the performance review and promotion process, right? Which is a feedback heavy process, right? Where you get told a lot of things about your performance, both positive and corrective. And I do think that like trust and psychological safety plays a huge part, like whether or not that exists in your culture, plays a huge part in how effective these conversations actually ultimately end up being in the workplace. So really excited to dig into that with you here. Just to kind of back up a little bit and kind of catch our listeners up, but here on the Workplace Therapy Podcast, we discuss a number of topics, but the common thread is interactions in the workplace that have the potential to cause trauma or some kind of negative emotional impact that just kind of like sticks with us as human beings. And as I was alluding to earlier, there's perhaps no other process that stokes those flames of workplace trauma with a small t more strongly than the performance review and promotion process. So Annie, I've talked a little bit about this, but I mean, would you agree with that assessment that these are like, that the performance review process is a point in time where you kind of see the potential for a lot of, kind of like trauma and, suboptimally handled situations?
Totally. And I think one thing that's really interesting about the performance review or promotion process is so many things can go wrong, but the process itself is usually designed if everything goes right. And so obviously as humans, we know that there will be multiple opportunities or multiple points in the process that things may go slightly off the direction they're supposed to go. And so that alone just creates a lot of space for human error, accidents, obviously good intentions that maybe lead to difficult outcomes. But one thing that I have reflected a lot about in my career, as well as a human being, is so much of our culture, at least I feel like in the United States, is our career advancement or career success is like so directly tied to our personal success. Like if I have not climbed the ladder, I am a failure. Or if I have not advanced, I've been in the same role for 6 years, what's wrong with me? And it's like, there's so many things that are wrong with that, obviously, that perspective, but it's something that stands out to me. And so ultimately, our performance and someone else's perception of our performance is so deeply personal. And at least I think for the majority of people, right? And so with that, you combine that plus a process that has multiple steps with multiple opportunities for things to go wrong, you end up with a process where sadly, a lot of things do go wrong, and maybe not, again, ill-intentioned, but it can be a process that absolutely creates difficult moments for human beings that, trauma with a little t, or maybe trauma with a big T. It just depends on the circumstance.
I mean, that's so true. Like, I don't want to minimize anybody's, trauma. We're careful to use the word trauma very, of course. Or as appropriately as we can, right? Because we don't want to minimize people who have been through some truly like world and life altering stuff in the past. But you're right. I mean, like there are workplace situations, especially around performance reviews and promotions, because of how invested we tend to be culturally into what we've chosen to do as a profession, that could manifest as significant sorts of trauma for people. I love what you said. I just wanted to rewind a little bit about, I love this insight of, we here in the States in particular tend to tie a lot of our self-worth and our identity to what we do for work, how quickly we're progressing at work, how much money we earn, which companies we work for, right? And to an extent, I think it's understandable that we would take some sense of pride and self-satisfaction from that. But I do think that I've seen that, here in the States, we're more predisposed to lean into that a little bit too much, right? I mean, even down to the language that we use, with little kids, right? It's like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like, we frame everything in this context of what's your contribution to the workforce going to be, instead of like, who do you want to be when you grow up? What are the things that interest you, right? It's like, I think that gives a lot more room, like, to kind of explore, who you are, what your strengths are, like align with something that feels very purpose-filled for you, but then also doesn't like almost like perfunctorily like keep you imprisoned to a specific career track, right? Like I see a lot of people who fall down that trap too, where it's like, they look down 10, 15 years into their career and they've gotten so far that they figure they might as well just keep going, even though they've kind of fallen out of love with the work and,
100%.
Would rather be doing other things. So yeah, lots of emotions that are really kind of like tied up here in the performance review process. Absolutely. Well, so we're going to talk a lot about like the things that could go wrong and like how we can potentially inoculate ourselves from the risk of that moving forward. But before we do, it really occurred to me that you and I, having participated in performance review and promotion processes before, kind of have an advantage in understanding like what goes on behind the curtain. But it occurred to me that like most people in an organization, like unless you manage people and are invited into this process, you don't really know like what the process even looks like. It's like you might talk with your manager about your performance, like, at regular intervals throughout the year. And then one day you get your performance review delivered to you. Sometimes it's tied to compensation decisions too, which can complicate things, right? And then you have no appreciation or visibility into the dozens of conversations that happen behind the scenes in most cases to kind of arrive at that conclusion. So Annie, I think it would be like really useful for our audience if you would just kind of, from your experience having led many of these in the past, just kind of like break down for us, like what does the typical performance review and promotion process look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that there's about 3 sections that if you had to break them up into buckets or milestones, there's 3 areas that the typical performance review or promotion process can be broken into. So the first one is really like the prep, like you're deciding what's the feedback, looking back, reflecting on, my team's performance. What are the things that I want to say? What are the things that they're doing well? What are the projects they've delivered? We always want to talk about specific examples. So you're usually time bounding the area that you're reviewing. Some companies do this quarterly, some do it twice a year, some do it once a year. And so depending on the time frame they're looking at, they're reflecting back on that period, pulling specific examples or bodies of work that you've owned or delivered, and using that to help shape their overall assessment of how you did. So that manager prep may sound like it's a simple step, but typically it is the longest step of the process because managers have to collect a lot of data, and they're also usually collecting 360 feedback in some sort of format. It depends on the company's approach, but ultimately seeking out close cross-functional partners or peers to be able to hear their perspective as well. Obviously, your manager doesn't see what you do every single day, all day. So it's very valuable. So I want to make sure people understand like that is a huge body of work and a large responsibility of the manager, but it is ultimately their job and their responsibility. So it's a big, big part of the process. So when done well, there's a lot of data gathering, there's a lot of thought and reflection put into it. And then ultimately you prepare an outcome, which is usually a rating or a recommendation to promote someone or not promote them, depending on what you gather. And so you prepare that for the second step of the process, which is usually some sort of calibration. So one thing that's really important, depending on the size of your company, but also just to make sure we're being consistent and fair, is the calibration is a step where you have the opportunity as a manager to share your reflection and your recommendation of what is right for the employee, whether that's a rating again, or a promotion or not a promotion. with a group of people who have employees in similar situations. That's typically by level or in like function. So if you're on the engineering team, you're probably with other engineering managers. If you're with the finance team, same thing. So that manager presents that to a peer set, and there's a discussion. And that discussion is usually people either affirming their experience of that employee or offering a different perspective. And so it can be a really enlightening step in the process where you learn a lot about your team member that maybe, again, you're not having that direct visibility, but can be super insightful. So when done well, it's again, that discussion, that dialogue, and gives you clarity as a manager and ideally affirmation of, am I correct in my assessment or am I maybe a little bit misaligned, and what additional feedback or conversations do I need to have? So one thing I think people probably don't realize that happens in that step is you ideally walk away with an outcome, the manager, whether that's, yes, it's been approved that my calibration was, or my assessment was correct, or I need to have further discussion. And so sometimes when we're not aligned, that full group of people is probably not the best group of people to make the next decision. And so sometimes we encourage people to take it outside of that room and have further discussion. And that's especially when there's misalignment. Somebody maybe brings up an example that conflicts with the assessment of the manager. So like, let's pull the HR team with, a manager or this peer and have a little discussion around where we ultimately agree that employee sits. Again, whether that's promotion or a certain rating. And then finally, after that conversation is the last part and probably the shortest part of the process, which is where you actually have the conversation with the employee. So maybe short in terms of how long it takes to have those conversations, but so important because the delivery of that outcome is obviously what that employee is waiting on and is hoping is fair and an accurate reflection of their performance. And so those are really the three buckets across the promotion and talent review process, performance review process. It's a lot, so I'm happy to go into any in further detail, but that's typically how I have seen it broken up.
Yeah, I love how you break that down. I think that's pretty consistent with my experience having been a participant in these exercises in the past. I love how you break it down into like 3 milestones, which are pretty distinct. There's the manager assessment, the calibration, conversations with other leaders, and then the overall delivery. And, just as you were talking and kind of like describing each of those milestones, all the memories started flooding back to me of all the times in which I've participated in this. And so, I think it's really interesting. So let's start with manager assessments, if you don't mind. One of the things that I notice, or that I discovered early on, as a leader is that you're right. The amount of data collection that it takes to really give compelling and clear feedback at the end of the year, especially if you're with a company that only really does this once a year, that's a long period of time to, be collecting data. And unfortunately, one of the things that I see a lot of leaders do is not really be intentional about collecting data and observations, about the performance of all the people on their team systematically throughout the year, and I think that's the difference between a really high impact performance review conversation at the end of the year versus one that seems really low impact and actually more likely to cause trauma because if you don't have those specific examples in your back pocket, as a participant, if I'm reporting to you, I'm going to feel like all my work this year was totally overlooked. You weren't watching, you weren't looking, yep. Right? And it's and I could walk out of that performance review conversation being just really deflated the following year. So have you seen, have you seen that as a problem, or, a limitation of performance review processes that you've led through? And if so, it's what do you think good best practices are to kind of counteract that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this because there was something as you were talking that stood out to me that I don't know that I've actually thought about this before as a piece of advice, but I was like, oh yes, this is the thing I want to say. So yes, I think that depending on the cadence in which your company does performance review, every manager should always have a TB doc, a one-on-one doc, where you have notes about things that you've discussed, bodies of work that you can point back to as reference. That's the probably easiest, lightest lift of like, do it as you go so that you have a record to go back and review when it is time to reflect back on that performance. I would also say for managers that are in role now and leave a company, please leave notes. Please leave notes about how your direct reports are performing, because when you leave, you're essentially leaving an employee with someone else who likely will not have data points, who likely has not spent time with that person. And I've seen this happen so often where people are consistently passed up for promotions because their manager changed 2 or 3 times. And there was no one to advocate for that employee. And that is like truly when the system breaks down and does not serve people. And so being able to, oftentimes I think also being able to have a consistent tool where you're saving this information, like a record, a true record. How often have you inherited a team where you go into, your HRIS or your whatever your company uses, and you're like, are there any notes on this employee? Like anything I should know as I onboard this person or as I onboard myself. And so as a manager, I think if I could give one piece of advice, it's, obviously your biggest responsibility is taking care of your team and making sure your team is delivering, but like also thinking about the individual and how you can support them even after you're gone. And so being able to walk away as an offboarding task of like, here's a document with notes on all of my employees, like please handle them with care. And please, like, here's my recommendation if there is one around, I think this person will be ready to promote in a few months, or this person really needs additional support in X area. And so if you want to be a solid manager and really take care of your people and not cause unintentional workplace trauma, leave notes and support your team so that there is someone to vouch for them and a record to vouch for them.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and unfortunately is something that I feel like can go overlooked fairly easily, right? Like, so if you're the manager of this team and you either got a promotion internally, a reassignment internally, or a whole new job at a different company, it's almost like your focus is tightened to really just like that piece, right? And and I think like leaders really should like kind of reflect back on, what it's like to kind of be left in a lurch, right? And to have done all this work working for this manager and just realize that like you are the bridge, like, whether or not that person's, development continues along that path, like is dependent on how well you can pass the baton. And I do think that that is probably like one of your biggest responsibilities as a leader, is making sure that people's development is continuous, regardless of whether or not you stay in that seat for like an extended period of time. Really, really interesting stuff. Oh, and I'd also say that, I mean, from either end, right? Like if you have a developing employee who has performance management issues, you need to make sure that there's continuity along that end, right? Like not that you basically give somebody a shadow that they can never crawl out from underneath, right? But, an objective fact-based, like here are the deficiencies, here are the gaps, here's, the performance improvement plan that we've agreed upon and how they've been progressing, right? So that it's not just like, hey, we're resetting this accountability once I leave. And then like even more so for the people who are, developing towards promotion readiness, right? Having that continuity is just so important. And it really is terrible to be that person who's overlooked for 2 or 3 performance review cycles before they can get enough continuity, but they've been a great performer the entire time. They just didn't have an advocate in their corner, That actually brings me to the next piece, which is calibrations. And so I'm interested to get your perspective on this, Annie, because so we recently in one of our past episodes, we interviewed the CEO of this company who had developed a platform to kind of revolutionize the performance review process, because in his estimation or their estimation, the calibration process kind of like unfairly advantaged leaders with certain strengths or people who report to leaders with certain strengths, right? So if you are a charismatic, influential leader who's really like going to bat for your people and can make anything sound good, right? Like those people tend to be greeted with less opposition in the calibration cycle and tend to get more of the things that they want out the other end. But if you're an introverted leader, right, who your assessment of your person's promotion readiness might be spot on, but I think like the dynamic of the room might be such that, you know, they kind of marginalize the data that you bring to the table in favor of people who are more just kind of like energetic and enthusiastic. So I'm wondering if you've come across this in your travels, and if there's things that you've done, you know, from an HR team perspective to try to mitigate the impact of, you know, personality styles playing into people's promotion readiness.
Oh, I love this so much. And it's something that until you've sat through many, many of those conversations, you probably wouldn't pick up the pattern in the beginning. So I have so many questions too about this platform, because I love the idea that somebody's working on this. Okay. So one thought on my end is, well, two thoughts. One is everybody needs to fill out or prepare the same assessment, right? That's super important. We need to be grading. We need the same grading scale, because if one manager is assessing talent one way and a different manager is assessing talent a different way, how can those two things coexist when we're trying to be fair and consistent around decisions that truly impact people's pay and success and progression in the company? So like really having a template that is looking for facts and examples, and ideally that has a competency or a skill that is being graded specifically or assessed specifically, I think is super important. So I've worked when there's been like, we're just talking strengths and opportunities, and that can be very high level. And again, is very dependent on job. But then having consistent competencies across a certain group that are being assessed in the same conversation, I think is really important. The second thing I would say that I found to help the behavior you're calling out, where people that are just great at public speaking, maybe people who have been in sales roles before, or, you know, people that are like pitching their employee and are great at it. There are some that are not, and that shouldn't penalize the employee, right? And so I totally agree with what you're saying. The best process step that I've seen from a people perspective that we've done, or like an HR side that we've done to, I think, hinder that a little bit, that potential disadvantage, is instead of having someone vocally share their pitch or their recommendation, preparing a template or a deck, and then spending the first 3 minutes reviewing the deck asynchronously. So everybody is pulling up the deck, everybody is reading the notes, everyone is seeing how they scored on assessments, they're seeing 360 feedback, and then ultimately the discussion begins there. So there's not even a pitch at all. It's just, I'm recommending this person for a promotion, or this is the grading scale or this is the talent rating that I have assessed them at. Here's the evidence. And then letting everyone read, and it should be able to speak for itself, was the perception. And so towards the end of my time at Stitch Fix, that was more of how we were running the promotion process, since we were going through many promotions at once. And I found that to be really successful, because there were a lot of people that did not feel prepared or enabled to vocally express what they wanted to express in a room full of really intimidating people, you know, especially if you're with VPs or senior leaders that you've never spoken in front of, to be able to defend something that you maybe and ideally really believe, I think is great to just let the work speak for itself. And I found that to be super impactful as like a process adjustment. I
love that idea. I think like that's so great. And I think it also kind of solves for the problem of airtime, right? You know, I think like in more traditional calibration processes, you know, people just kind of like, they come to the table with their notes. Their notes are of variable quality. Like people are of variable ability to keep things concise. Like I'm not one of those that can keep things concise. And so like, I might like chew up like all of this airtime, and then other people might not have the time or the leisure to like really go as deep deep into their case as they want to, because that's also a factor in the process. So I love that best practice that you guys came up with to basically like have a deck and like put all of the relevant information in there and give everybody a fair shake. I think that's fantastic.
And I will say one quick last note on that. There was still the example of managers not being prepared, right? Like they had submitted their deck slides and the deck slides were weak. Maybe they were missing feedback. Maybe they were missing detail on certain assessment. And so that became very apparent to everyone in the room that it wasn't because of this manager's skill in selling the promotion or selling the talent rating. It was just lack of evidence or lack of preparedness on the manager part. And so that was usually where the manager or the director of that particular person presenting, that was their follow-up, right? Is this truly a lack of evidence or is this a lack of preparedness on the manager part? And so that was something that HR would work with the senior leaders to kind of research in the background to make sure, again, the employee is not being penalized because we have a performance issue at the manager level.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I love that you guys like took it to that level, right?
Yeah.
Where you're serious enough about, hey, this is one of the primary competencies of the leadership role, to the point that we will talk to you about it. Like how you show up in a calibration. We're not just talking about other people's performance. Like this is part of your performance and your overall effectiveness. I think that's
100%.
That's a really, really great perspective. I did want to talk a little bit about delivery because I know that you've helped me scripting some pretty tough messages in the past. And my guess is your skills in that area have only grown as you've continued to kind of take on more and more senior level positions. But what are some best practices in terms of delivery? Because I do feel like that is where I've seen a lot of these conversations can fall apart, where,
Totally.
you have a manager who just kind of like fumbles the messaging a little bit, or maybe doesn't kind of like own the like balance that line between like, being like, a mentor and a developer of that person, but also being a leader organizationally, right? And showing support behind what the company's objectives are and like navigating that conversation in a balanced way, cause like, and to be honest, it's really hard, right?
Yes.
Like it's a really hard thing. Cause like part of you wants to be really empathetic and overshare with your direct reports because it kind of takes a lot of the discomfort off of you. And it's like, hey, it's not me, it's the company. Right. And like other people swing too far the other way. And they're basically like, they hide behind this is what the company says that we should do.
Right.
And they over index on that, but they don't really kind of like engage in the humanity of the conversation. So I'd love to like what are some tips that you give leaders, especially like new leaders entering this process, because it can be really, really tough to figure out the right things to say.
Yeah, absolutely. So I believe wholeheartedly that the first step in having a successful conversation, especially if it's going to be a tricky one, is you have to be prepared for that conversation. You have to sit down and like really try to break down some thoughts of what it is that you want to get across. What's the top message that you want this person to walk away with, and then work from there. And so I always prepare for tough conversations and prepare some bullet points for myself. And then I go through it a couple of times, practice in my head. And that helps me feel more confident and not like I'm reading from a script when I'm actually delivering the conversation. So I can be more present as a human being. I would also say, don't bury the lead. I think a lot of times when people have bad news, they do. Can I curse on this podcast?
Oh, of course.
Yes. The shit sandwich.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to thank you real quick, Annie, because like normally I hold back until my guest like sets the tone, but like I'm in a much more comfortable place now. But yes, tell us about the shit sandwich.
So the shit sandwich is something that many people do, and many people don't even actually know that that's what they're doing, because they'll say like, I've peppered in some nice things to kind of soften the message. And it's like, or you're confusing the person that's receiving the message. And so you're watering down what it is that you're trying to get across. And so, yes, I think it's okay to try and be kind and add some kind language into the conversation, but as long as it's not at the expense of the message. You have to make sure the person is clear when they walk away from that conversation with what it is you're trying to say. So don't bury the lead. Don't come in and you're so great at this and you're so great at that, but XYZ. Don't do that. That's my personal, very strong opinion. And then I say, like, lead with candor and lead with kindness. And so it's like, I have some tough news to share. That's maybe the second thing out of my mouth. I want to talk about your talent review. I want to talk about your performance review. I do have some tough news to share. It's not the outcome that we had hoped for. And then you go into the why, because I do think that it's important for that person to hear up front, because otherwise they're sitting there chomping at the bits for what is the answer, yes or no. And I think you also have to be prepared for that person to not be in a place to hear the rest in that moment. Depending on their capacity to receive the news, if they're distraught, if it's something that they feel like they were promised or it was like a slam dunk, you may not be successful in delivering the context supporting the decision or the outcome. And so be prepared to have multiple conversations with that employee so that they can come back to a space where they feel capable of digesting that information. So I want to give you all the context around how we got here. Do you want me to share that now? Or are we in a place where we need to come back and have that conversation tomorrow? It is totally your choice. So like giving them agency to say what they need on a human level in that moment is like something I think is super powerful.
Oh my God, so much wisdom there, Annie. Two things that I want to pull out that you said. I mean, so the first is the idea that you don't have to deliver the whole kit and caboodle in one conversation. The power of the pause and like taking a break is something that I think is so underrated and so underutilized in the workplace. But I feel like if more leaders just gave themselves permission to take a pause and to continue the conversation later, outcomes would be so much better, right? Because what happens is like, you know, you engage people, they're not ready to hear the whole message. You keep powering through, you're just pushing them further and further outside of their window of tolerance into emotional dysregulation. And then their ability to hear your intent is going to diminish. And then your ability to deliver it like in an eloquent way is also going to diminish because you're going to be picking up on their energy, right? And like, that's where things just get really bad. And so like the power of like taking that break, I think is something that a lot of like leaders need to hear. Or, I mean, if you're an individual contributor, receiving it from your manager, don't be afraid to advocate for what you need and just be like, hey, you know, I really appreciate you having this conversation with me. I know it's probably not easier for you either. Would it be okay if I took, you know, a couple of hours, or maybe we circled back in a day or two, because I'm finding myself, you know, kind of reacting in some kind of way, and for there just to be no judgment about that. You know, I think is totally good. And like the second piece is that concept of the window of tolerance, right? I don't think that we talk about it a lot on the Workplace Therapy podcast because we really believe in integrating somatic self-awareness with leadership. Like, so basically understanding how emotions kind of play a part in how we show up, like in the work that we do as leaders, right? But it's not something that's talked about a lot, like, you know, within the work setting, right? You know, in fact, unless you're fortunate enough to work for a company with cultural values like be your best self, you know, which Annie, you and I have fond memories of working at a company where that was truly a North Star of theirs. Most places are kind of like, leave yourself at the door, right? Leave yourself at the door. And like, you know, when you come in, you are expected to act quote unquote professional. And what professional means is you're resilient and composed and non-reactive and emotionally regulated at all times and fully productive. And it's like, I just think that's a naive expectation to like put on people. Like we are whole people. We have darkness and light. We have, you know, positive qualities and things that we struggle with. And we need to create space for that. So I love that about the way that you've equipped your leaders to like navigate that delivery process. 'Cause I think it's so important.
Yeah, totally. One thing that I see a lot of more so in this day and age is, HR has become people and culture, and companies say people first organizations, or think like that's kind of a slogan that I hear more commonly now. To me, what we just talked about, that is people first in practice. Like, you have a job, your job is to deliver that message to the employee, right? Like, to do the promotion process, to go through the performance review process. In a people first organization, and for a people first manager, that's what that looks like in practice, in my opinion, is you are meeting the employee where they are, meeting the person where they are, and making sure that there is the ability to have that tough conversation, knowing that it may not be the outcome that they perceived. And so, like, I just wanted to draw that connection, because I think oftentimes we say people first and it sounds amazing, and I think we intend it to be the case, but it's sometimes difficult to tie examples to, in terms of like, what does that actually look like in practice for a people first organization?
Mm-hmm. Love that. So much great insight, Annie. All right. So shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk about misunderstandings about promotions in the workplace. And I'm sure you've seen all of the conversations from every possible angle, from every possible level of seniority, given the nature of your position. But at the end of the day, like, you as a participant, as an employee, have received a number of promotions. You've also overseen a lot of promotion processes. So what are some of the common misconceptions that you've seen that employees have around the promotion process?
Oh yeah, lots, especially because depending on where you are and how your company approaches promotions, they feel very behind closed doors. There's not a lot of context shared up front around what it looks like, what warrants a promotion. And so unless you have a manager that will share that information with you directly, you're kind of looking around, like waiting for something, and you may never actually get the context. So I think one thing that stands out to me is that there is a misunderstanding or a perception that promotions are available for anyone, and that in order to obtain a promotion, you just have to get better and better and better. And that is true, but what is missing there is that we are running businesses. Typically, when you're working in the corporate environment, there has to be a need for your role to go above and above and above. And the most common example I can give for people to really understand what that looks like is, if you're running a team of 10 engineers, we don't need 3 directors on that team. So you may have, 3 managers that are operating incredibly, but we don't need 3 directors. And so not everyone can get promoted. And so that's where, this concept of the business need comes into play. And so when I've seen promotions done well, that starts there. Like, obviously the employee's readiness is so important, but without a need for the business to have that person operate at the next level, it's pretty irresponsible of the business to just promote. You're going to run out of money. You're going to have people standing on top of each other, doing each other's work. You're going to be top heavy as an organization. And so there is a delicate balance between how you manage business need and employee readiness.
Well, and Annie, if I could just jump in a little bit, I think it's also really important to consider that just giving people endless pathways to promotions is actually not in best service of them and their continued development as well, right? Because there actually is a level of contribution that certain titles are expected to be able to perform at in the marketplace, right? And so if you work at an organization that's very liberal about handing out new titles and new promotions and new raises, eventually you're going to find yourself at a point where you either have to or want to get a job somewhere else. And you might find that even though you think you should be titled at a certain level, you're actually not qualified on paper to take those jobs with your same title and your same level of compensation elsewhere, because there actually wasn't a business need. They were just promoting you based off of the fact that you had decent performance year over year, right? And so I do think, to your point about the irresponsibility, I do think that there's a balance there, right? Like, companies do have to think about like what is long-term in the best interest of that of that person, right? And that the scope of their work actually warrants the title and the compensation that they are given. But I do think, like, just to bat it back to you, people's main concern is actually the opposite of that dynamic, where they feel like they're undertitled and underscoped and undercomped, So what are your feelings about that, and how organizations or leaders can work to kind of mitigate those impacts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think often I would inquire or look into, are managers having development conversations about what's next for employees? Because in many situations where an employee feels ready or feels like they deserve a promotion, I have found my experience that often maybe there isn't a level setting conversation that has happened with the employee about whether or not there is a business need or whether or not the employee is ready. So oftentimes employees naturally compare themselves to maybe peers, people that they see doing similar work that are either a level above them or a level at their level or a level below them. I mean, we've all been guilty of this, right? I think back to my first career or my first job in HR, and I definitely compared myself to my peers. And I think that can be helpful, but also can be very harmful because you only have one vantage point when you're doing that, and that's yours. And so when a manager whose job is to assess their full team's performance and to make sure that that employee is meeting the expectations of the role that they're in, that's the manager's job, is to have that conversation with the employee holistically about, what does it look like to get to the next level? What are some of the skills that you would need to demonstrate, or some of the bodies of work that you would need to deliver? And or am I there, or is there a certain area that I'm still needing more time or experience in? Because that's the conversation that I think doesn't happen until promotion time or performance review time. And then you're doing a lot of backpedaling because an employee maybe feels like it's time and they have, for whatever reason, made that assessment for themselves, whether it's a previous manager shared that, other people have commented that, I don't know, this happens all the time. I don't know why you're not a level 8, or I don't know why you're not a senior manager. And but the person who actually gets to make that decision, are they having that conversation with the employee? And often I find that some of that misunderstanding is because of a lack of conversation that's happening way in advance or on a fluid basis between those two parties.
Yeah. Yeah. So once again, circling back to this idea of like, Getting your people where they want to go from a personal development and professional development perspective requires consistent investment over the long run, requires intentionality, right? And I think, unfortunately, too few people, both the leaders and the employees themselves, really start thinking about it until performance review process kicks off. Because I think that, as an employee, you can also take some ownership over your own development. You can kick off these conversations with your boss, like, hey, I want to be promotion ready. Like, I've set a goal for myself to do that within the next 1 to 2 years. I'm open to feedback you might have on what gaps I might have so that we can work on it this calendar year. But I just want to set my intention with you that this is where I'd like to go and this is how I'd like to work with you, and it's like, you have that authority, like you have that ability. Don't wait, for your, yes. For your leader to come to that conclusion organically.
Yeah. Can I make one comment there? I totally agree with that statement because, like I mentioned at the beginning of this, I've been lucky and had some incredible people managers who have advocated for me that definitely influenced my ability to grow and scale. But I have also worked with some managers that don't do that. And you're 100% right that you should advocate for yourself, especially if you find yourself in a position where your manager isn't inquiring about that. What are you looking for in your development? Or what's next for you? What do you want to work on? And you may not know the answer to that, but I encourage everyone to seek that conversation out with their manager. And your manager should be open to that conversation. And so my advice is, if your manager is not open to that conversation, it may be time to think about, is this the right place for me? Or is this the right manager for me? Whether there may be other opportunities in that same organization, maybe not. But people leave bad jobs, right? People also leave bad managers. That's statistically been very proven. And so if you find yourself with a people manager that refuses to engage in that conversation, that's the core of their job. And so if they're not doing that, I just want people to know and feel empowered that they can and should start thinking about what's right for them, because ultimately we're talking about your career and we're talking about what you want. And if you can't find that because of a lack of ability or desire to be supported, you may be in the wrong organization.
Totally. Well, and I tell people this all the time. We actually did a podcast episode on this a few months back about, one of the things to look for when evaluating a job opportunity from day zero, before you even sign on with a company, is like, what's the cultural vibe as it pertains to professional development, right?
Yeah.
Is it, like I once applied for a job at a startup where they said, look, when you are offered a ticket on a rocket ship, you don't ask which seat. Which is just code for me that it's like, we actually have no defined job descriptions or contribution guidelines or promotion criteria. We have no idea what we want you to do. We just need you to do things and then trust that everything is going to work out on the back end. And it's like, in hindsight, I'm like, that was a huge red flag, But everything that you would think would happen as a natural consequence of that perspective actually ended up happening. Like performance review and calibration processes at this company were just so gnarly, and like the outcomes were so not equitable because of that. And then I'd also say people don't do enough diligence on really getting to know the person who would be their manager, like when they're in the interview process, or the application process for a new job. And to your point, Annie, it's like that's really determinative. Like when it comes to the performance review process, like whether you're going to get the encouragement, the perspective, the feedback that you need along the way to make a compelling case for you come year end, but then also whether that person is going to have the ammunition they need, right, to really go to bat for you in that process. Like these are really important things. And to your point, I think that's why people leave bad managers. It's not just because of the day-to-day toxicity, right? It's because you also feel a little stuck. Like if you don't have a manager that's willing to, kind of get in the ring for you.
Totally.
Cool. Well, let's wrap up our discussion here with one last question that might be spicy, but I want to talk to you about like transparency in the promotion process, right? Because as a leader navigating the promotion processes, you are constantly, in closed door meetings and then bringing information back to your people. And what's the right amount of transparency as a leader to kind of show, like, through this process?
Yeah, it's a dance. I think that there is a fine line between being overly transparent, and I'm not a parent, but I can imagine it's similar to giving your kids context or the amount of information that you share that is appropriate and for that person's benefit versus what will actually hurt that person to hear. And so I think about it in that way. I think a couple of tips that I would give in terms of the amount of transparency that's helpful. I do believe employees and people deserve to know what the process looks like. What are the steps of the process? And I believe that as a manager, it's important to share the feedback that went into the decision-making process with the employee. Now, if someone in the calibration process makes an off-color comment or shares a perception that is not based in direct experience, that happens. I don't think that that's helpful for the employee. I think that you have to, again, lead with transparency and similar to what we talked about with feedback, the amount that is helpful to the employee, the amount that is helpful in sharing the context that led to the decision-making process. So I want to share with my team those pieces, whether there was some feedback from your partners that this project actually didn't go super well. And so I want to spend some time doing a retro with you and learning about what went wrong so that we can think about ways to avoid this in the future. Or if it's something that's out of your control, like a business need, like you mentioned earlier, that is a fine line between supporting the business and not blaming the business, while also making sure you share that I did advocate for you. So I think honesty in that conversation is really important, which, just again, to use an example, I think you could say something like, I want to be transparent that while I do believe you're ready for the promotion, right now the business isn't in a place where we can approve this promotion, or isn't in a place where we need another whatever level or another whatever title. I do want to be honest with you that that's the reason why this didn't go through. So I think we have a lot to talk about, whether are there other opportunities or skills that you want to work in? Is there a way that I can help you find development in a different area? Obviously, without having to leave the company. You and I have talked about like being committed to the person and their development in whatever facet or whatever way that looks like. So that could be in the role that is at the next level. That could also be in a different function, in a different team. And so being committed to that person and being honest with them about trying to support them in whatever way that looks like. So transparency, where it gives them the context they need to understand the decision, and transparency that it doesn't harm them. They don't need to know all the things that maybe would upset them or hurt their feelings if that was something that came out in the process. So and then transparency of supporting the business and owning the decision and maybe some of the determining factors, while not blaming or taking the easy road by just saying like, well, so-and-so shut this promo down. So that's really the person that you have to blame.
Right. Oh, I love that. Yeah. I mean, like something that came to mind as you were saying that is like, transparency, but not like gossip, right? Like
yes.
As soon as it becomes like personal and like you're spilling the tea and there's really no advantage other than to demonize somebody, mm-hmm. in the story, like that's not transparency anymore.
Right.
You're not doing it with the intent to be helpful. You might be
yes.
doing it with the intent to deflect blame or to deflect your own personal feelings of responsibility over the outcome. But it's like all you're really doing is making, your employee more sensitive to,
yes.
what this perspective might be. And it's ultimately doesn't really serve them. If I could tell a story real quick, Annie, because like when you were talking about transparency, about the availability of positions and like not being able to facilitate promotions because of business need or a lack of business need, it really actually brings me back to a story in my career, actually, when we were both working at Stitch Fix together, and I had started doing mentor meetings with our COO, who I know you also know quite well. And one of the most transparent leaders I've ever worked for, maybe to a fault sometimes, like, sometimes a little too transparent, but like I really appreciated it and I give him a pass most times. But I think he actually handled this conversation masterfully, because like we started our mentor meetings and he started by asking me, first meeting, he's like, what C-level position would you like to have one day? And I was like a director at the time, right? So like C-level was like, it felt like really far out into the distance. And nobody had ever asked me that question. I was just excited to be there. Like I love the culture. I love my job. I love my team, And so it really got me thinking. And then he told me, based off of things that he had directly observed and also things that he had heard from my boss, reasons why he felt like it wasn't crazy that I might be ready for a C-level position within the next 3 to 5 years. And so I was like, okay, so he established this like North Star career path for me. And then the next meeting, we talked about gaps. He's like, look, most of your career has been in CX, right? Like if you want to make a compelling case for COO, you need to also gain expertise and experience in other operational functions, right? And then what he told me at the end of that, it's like, look, I'm limited in what I can give you to actually bridge those gaps for you. It's like, we hired you to run our CX department. You're doing a great job there. We don't have a VP. We don't have like a business case for a VP level over CX at this point in time. Right. And so he's like, I'm going to be really honest with you that for as long as you're here, you might be waiting for a while before the next step along your journey comes. But he's like, honestly, if I were to lose you, it would be hugely inconvenient for me, but indexing on what is best for your career, you're probably better off looking for a job in, and then he like, basically gave me three different departments or functions within operations where I should be looking for VP level jobs. And lo and behold, a retained search recruiter reached out to me a couple of months after that meeting and offered me a position in one of those functions that really kind of checked all the boxes. And who's the first person I talked to about that with? It was him. Like, I scheduled a meeting with him and I'm like, I want you to look over this job description. Like, I'm really excited about this, but I'm like kind of sad about leaving the company. And he signed off on it. And he said, like, look, this is more compelling than anything I can offer you in the near future. And he's like, I think you need to take it. Right. He's like, it's going to be a tough thing to see you go, but like, you should take it. And like, honestly, Annie, I think about that freaking every day. Like every day, I think about that as just the standard of leadership that I aspire to in my life, to be so indexed on the person that even if, it means that my life becomes temporarily inconvenient in the short term, like I am doing what's right by them. And to me, it just felt like the perfect manifestation of transparency and empathy and feedback and everything that we've been talking about in our conversation so far.
Yeah. And putting the human first.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's best for them.
All right. You have shared with us an unreasonable amount of wisdom in like the hour that we've spent together so far. I am just so grateful to have had you on the show, because I think the insights that you've had really help to shed light on a process that many of us have gone through and been perennially just frustrated by. And hopefully this helps people to feel like more empowered about how to navigate that process moving forward. But now I get to put you in the hot seat real quick. So we're going to go to our lightning round. So the rules of the lightning round are simple. I'm going to ask you some questions. Some of them are, business and profession related. Some of them are not. You have 30 seconds to kind of answer just off the cuff. And so are you ready?
I am as ready as I will be.
Okay. All right. Great. First one. Let's start off easy. Who's a leader you look up to and why?
My dad in real life, and then in the corporate world, Megan Pittman. My dad was a coach and teacher for over 40 years. I use a lot of the things that I've learned from him and seeing him coach and develop relationships over time in my life, in my job. And then Megan Pittman, she was one of those managers that invested in me early on, gave me a lot of feedback, a lot of wisdom, really grateful.
Great choices. What's your bucket list vacation destination and why? I
would love to see the Alps, both the Swiss Alps and the Italian Alps. So I think just because it makes you feel very small in a very big setting and big world, and who wouldn't want to go there?
That's the first time anybody's mentioned that, but I think it sounds fantastic and idyllic. Okay, so tell us about the funniest or most awkward moment that you've had in the workplace.
Okay, without being in HR, I've had a lot of those. Once I discovered a peer who was taking naps in the women's bathroom during her breaks. Oh. That's all I'll say.
Okay, all right. That and you had to address it, or you just found it out? Okay, because that would be real awkward.
Yes, I just found it out, and then I didn't say anything because at the time it was a peer, and who am I to say what you can and can't do in the women's bathroom?
I mean, yeah, if you need a quick cat nap, why not? All right, what's the most useful non-work related app on your phone?
Useful. I love the Notes app because I use it for my workouts. I use it for meal planning. I use it for just a constant to-do list that is not related to work. So the Notes app is something that I just can't live without. I have a lot there.
I have so much in the Notes app too, but I also have not developed an organizational system for it. So it's literally just like an ADHD brain's worth of thoughts.
Yes.
It's uncategorized and everywhere. And I'm like, I hope I can find this if I need it in the future, but we'll see. All right. What's the most important thing that you've done to invest in your mental health this year?
Exercise has always been my form of stress relief and really grounding myself in what I physically need to do what can be a very emotionally taxing job. And so I usually exercise every morning, and workouts are expensive. Gyms are expensive. And so I remember always kind of making an excuse for not going to get the largest package or like going to a gym that had everything that I needed, until my partner said to me, like, your health is arguably one of the most important things. Why wouldn't you spend the money on it? And so it took that for me to say, okay, I'm going to get the unlimited Pilates package, or I'm going to get a gym that is more convenient for my commute every morning, but maybe is more expensive. So just remembering that that is an expense absolutely worth spending.
Oh, 100%. Oh, I love that. All right. What's your biggest pet peeve?
Lack of humility. I have a few.
Keep going.
Lack of humility is one of mine. And I think lying is another one. Just being dishonest.
Yeah. I don't know if those are pet peeves so much as just like basic expectations of, human interaction.
Okay, so but pet peeve. More pet peeve.
No, I'm not criticizing you. I'm just like, those are like, I agree with you, but go ahead with the pet peeve.
The pet peeve is I really hate like loud smacking when people are eating. It's really not nice to be around. And people that take their shoes off in planes. I can't. Leave your shoes on.
I'm guilty of both of those things. Look, I went to London recently, and I was like,
different. International flight is different.
Because I'm for listeners out there, I'm like a fairly like broad-shouldered, large dude, and so like I'm sitting in economy on this plane to London, and I'm like entombed, like I'm in a sarcophagus. And I'm like, dude, if there's one thing I am doing, I am kicking off these shoes so that because it's like 10 hours of that. If it helps, I had nobody sitting like directly next to me, but that
helps. That helps tremendously. Mine is more like you are completely no socks, no shoes, foot out. And then like they put it like on your side of the seat. And I'm like, put your foot away.
Put your foot away.
Get it away from me.
Okay, that's a good one. I mean, like, I'm with you there. I'm with you. I'm just also guilty.
We're all guilty of everything at some point.
What's a piece of literature or art that has most shaped your perspective on life or leadership?
Oh, man. I'm more a fiction book reader. So... not a book. And I would say art, it's music. For me, it's music. I've always been a music lover. My grandfather was, was musical. My dad is musical. That's something we bonded over very early in my life. My partner is very musical. So I cannot narrow it down to one album or one song or anything like that. But when I need to be in my feels and need to get some perspective and come back down to earth or just reflect on something, it is always my music. So I like all genres, all different decades of music. So music.
Love it. I'm with you there. Obviously.
I know. You've got your guitars.
Yeah. All right. What do you feel like your mission in life is? What do you think life's all about?
For me, it's just doing something that helps people. I've always wanted to help people. That's actually why I got into HR too. I knew I had a business degree. I went to school and studied business and thought, like, where in the business world do I want to work? And it was one of my best friends from growing up. It was his dad, who had been pretty successful in business, and said, you're a people person. You love people. Like, have you ever thought about HR? And, back then the stigma around HR was that you were hiring and firing only. And so I got into it kind of unknowingly without realizing what it was going to be all about. And through my career, I've been able to develop what is my personal type of HR, which is like really doing right by people and, having high integrity, but ultimately like really trying to help people. Like we spend so much time, you and I talked about this in our first conversation, but we spend so much time at work, and work can be such a challenging place that I hope that in difficult times, I can help be someone that shows people kindness and shepherds them through tough times in a way that is respectful and honest, and obviously in support of that person, while also maybe doing what's right for the business, because that's my job. But I just want to help people. I want to do something that's bigger than myself and that's giving back to others.
Yeah. Well, Annie, that's certainly been my experience of you in the years that we've worked together. And I know that the team at Phi is just so fortunate to have a person with your ethos, your character, your integrity in the role, because I know that having somebody like you within an organization just has a multiplicative impact on how people treat other people. And so anyway, I think you're doing a great job of living into your values there. I want to thank you so much just for spending so much time with us, for sharing a bunch of your wisdom and your experience. That wraps us up for this episode of the Workplace Therapy Podcast. If you would like, you can leave us a review on Apple iTunes or on Spotify. And if you need any help with employee engagement or leadership development training, you can reach out to us at info@unityandcompany.com. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.